Thanks everyone for being here tonight. I hope everybody's well and staying warm and safe and healthy. You guys are in for a real treat tonight. Our guest is a graduate of Morehouse College, and he earned a master's degree from Harvard Divinity School and another master's and a PhD from Columbia University. Reverend Delman Coates is the senior pastor of Mount Enon Baptist Church in Clinton, Maryland. He's the founder of Our Money, an economic justice campaign that seeks to solve some of our nation's greatest social and economic challenges. Just so you know, the advisory council of Our Money includes a lot of our real progressives comrades like Fadl Kaboub, Rohan, Pavlina, Sandy Darity, Bob Hockett, Steph Kelton, and a real all-star team you have there. Reverend Coates also founded the Black Church Center for Justice and Equality to address the social and spiritual challenges of the African-American faith community. So without further ado, our guest tonight, Reverend Delman Coates. Sir?
Good evening, and thank you so much, John and Virginia, for the invitation to be here tonight. Certainly, I want to acknowledge and thank Stephen as well for his friendship and for the invitation to come. As John mentioned, I am a local pastor who is deeply committed to helping to make our world a more inclusive and a more just place for all people. And out of that deep conviction, I launched about 2 years ago the Our Money campaign. Our Money is a campaign that really seeks to mainstream modern monetary theory and to build public support for a set of public policies that we'll talk about tonight that I believe are deeply critical to developing an economy that provides economic stability and security for all people. So I'm really delighted for tonight's conversation. Look forward to the dialogue later after my presentation. I've been asked to talk about modern monetary theory and the fight for economic justice, particularly as it relates to the civil rights movement, which in many ways I believe that economic justice is the unfinished work of the civil rights movement. We all know that at the time of his death, Dr. King was fighting for the rights of sanitary workers. And so I want to go right into our presentation tonight. Hope you will enjoy tonight's presentation as we will cover both of the civil rights background as I understand it, and go over some of the policies that the Our Money campaign is fighting for. Now, I want to let those of you listening that if you want some basic information about the Our Money campaign, you can go to ourmoneyus.org. Tonight, we want to cover the following issues in tonight's conversation. We want to look at the civil rights background of the fight for economic justice. And then I want to cover some of the core policies that the Our Money campaign is organizing the public around. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we seek to do is to mainstream modern monetary theory for the average person on the street. We've been fortunate to assemble an expert panel of economic advisors, economists, and researchers. And, one of the things that I think that I've been gifted with, and one of the things that I have to focus on as a pastor, certainly as a scholar and academic, is how to translate, very high level concepts into language that's acceptable to people on the street, people in the pews, to the seniors in our congregation, who at the end of the day want to know how we can, why it is that banks get bailed out and homeowners are getting put out. That's really how I got started in this work 10 years ago as a pastor and faith leader, looking at the way in which the foreclosure crisis devastated our community and our members in our churches. And yet I was looking on television and saw the way in which bankers were getting bailed out and homeowners were getting put out of their homes. And so that really started me on this long journey of wanting to understand the global financial crisis and how we solve it. We third want to look at what are some of the barriers to progress. I then want to explain some core foundational principles of modern monetary theory and how we can shift our mindset from the conventional economic framework to one that is more inclusive. And then I want to sort of lay out where do we go from here. So the fight for economic justice is not a new phenomenon. We are having this conversation tonight in the midst of Black History Month. And as I understand Black History Month is about chronicling the historic struggle of people of African ancestry to fight for human dignity and equality, and ultimately freedom. And one of the largest civil rights rallies in US history was one that many of us are familiar with. It is the March on Washington. We know it as the March on Washington. Unfortunately, the full title of the March on Washington is oftentimes cut off. And as a result, we miss what is perhaps the most important point of the march. And that is, it was a march for jobs and freedom. The full title of the march is the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And so there are several organizations when one looks at the historic trajectory of the African-American freedom struggle in the first 2/3 of the 20th century. There are many organizations that really came together to effect change. There was the NAACP, Congress of Racial Equality, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And then that really positions us in 1955 with the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, and then the Council of Federated Organizations. This is when many of these groups came together to think about what are some of the key needs for the country, and in particular, African Americans. So the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, we all know that march happened on August the 23rd, 1963. And as I just mentioned, the jobs and freedom portion of the march is unfortunately not emphasized. It's the part that we miss. And as a consequence, we tend to think that the point and the purpose of the march sort of centers around many of the common quotes from Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech when he talks about racial unity and harmony. But the focus of the march really centered around economic justice and equal access to equal access, providing a dignified job with benefits for every American that wanted one. And so the whole fight and struggle was centered around this particular legislative goal and objective. Next slide. So I want to.
When we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Right. So we are all familiar with the great crescendo of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. I do want to just sort of share a sort of important anecdote. This concept of I have a dream was actually not one that was unique to King. He actually heard it at a prayer service from the late Reverend Prathia Hall Wynne. Many times before the civil rights leaders marched and had rallies, they had prayer services. And in that prayer service, I believe a week before the I Have a Dream speech, Reverend Prathia Hall Wynne prayed. And in that prayer, she kept using the refrain, I have a dream. And over and over and over, she talked about this dream, and I have a dream. And Dr. King approached her afterwards and said, I really like that. I think I'm going to use it. Obviously, the full substance of the way in which he fleshes that out in his speech was not there in her prayer, but this whole concept of how I have a dream comes from Reverend Prathia Hall Wynne. Just wanted to give her credit for that. So we all know this portion of the speech. And today we are struggling with many of the same issues that America struggled with back then. We're struggling for economic justice for all people. And one of the issues that I confront as a pastor is I see communities struggling from the lack of adequate resources and the inequitable distribution of wealth, where in too many of our communities all across the country, Black and brown communities, poor communities, struggle with separate facilities when it comes to their schools, job opportunities, quality of life. And it's my conviction that my work constitutes the unfinished work of the civil rights movement. And it's critical for me. I'm deeply passionate about how we restore our democracy and putting our democracy back into the hands of the people. This is a major challenge for us in America, which is why I'm really delighted to be with you tonight with Real Progressives. When we think about the elements of King that we often remember, the great rhetoric of his sermons and his speeches, the I Have a Dream speech. Unfortunately, there are portions of his message and his ministry that we often forget. And that's the part that I really want to focus on tonight. It really moves me and animates me in a profound way. While we remember the climax of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, there are portions in the speech that I think we often miss, that I think are just as important. Think about the words in the speech where he says early on things like, 100 years later, the Negro lies on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. Later on, he says, but we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we have come to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and security of justice. We also recall in some of Dr. King's sit-ins, we recall, for example, that after the Greensboro lunch counter sit-in 1960, Dr. King said, what good is it to have the right to sit at a lunch counter if you can't afford the hamburger? King launched the Poor People's Campaign and put an economic and social bill of rights together that espoused a national responsibility to provide work for all. I note this in particular because it's important for us to understand this is the context of King's language about a guaranteed income, about a national responsibility to provide work for all. King advocated for a job guarantee, which would require the government to provide jobs to anyone who could not find one and end involuntary unemployment. The Bill of Rights also included the right of every citizen to a minimum income and the right to an adequate education. Now, I want to say this parenthetically, that this movement for a job guarantee actually predates King by about 2 decades. There's a Black woman by the name of Sadie Alexander. Sadie Alexander was the nation's first Black economist who in the 1940s talked about the need to bring about economic security in America through a federal job guarantee, where the federal government would provide dignified work at a dignified wage to every American that wanted one. She felt that a federal job guarantee would help to provide economic security for Blacks and help to buffer some of the racism and racial anxiety that people felt in America. If poor whites and working class whites knew that their jobs and the ability to provide for their families was not threatened by people of other races and ethnic groups. So she felt that the way to buffer much of the racial tension was to provide economic security. So King is really continuing this language. He inherits this language, this tradition of looking for a job guarantee. And we're going to talk about a bit more about that later. Also in King's final speech delivered on April the 3rd, 1968, the night before his life was taken from him in Memphis, Tennessee. We all remember the I've been to the mountaintop portion of that speech where he talks about, where he gives this great sort of, apocalyptic vision of the end. We all know the kind of climax of that sermon, but really the most important part of that sermon is in the middle where he says the following. Now, the other thing we have come to do is this, to always anchor our external direct action with the power of economic withdrawal. Later on, he says, I call upon you to take your money out of the banks downtown and deposit your money into tri-state banks. We want a bank-in movement in Memphis. So go to the Savings and Loan Association. I'm not asking you for something that we don't do ourselves at the SCLC. You have 6 or 7 Black insurance companies in Memphis. Take your insurance there. We want to have an insurance in. And later on in that speech, he says, now these are some practical things we can do. We begin the process of building a greater economic base. So what we see here is that even at the end of his life, King is thinking more about the importance of economic empowerment. And while we don't know how the full evolution of his thoughts, how his thoughts would have evolved as it relates to economics, we do see here that he is thinking about the importance of economics in the context of the civil rights movement, which is really critically important. It is why we say that economic justice is the unfinished work of the civil rights movement. So what we have done is to take these ideas and we have taken these ideas in the Our Money campaign and really have tried to coalesce our work around 3 core areas. And we're right now organizing faith leaders and civil rights leaders all across the country around 3 main priorities that center around jobs, which also includes a focus on infrastructure and the environment, education, public education, and healthcare. Here are some very important facts for us to be mindful of. Right now, the national unemployment rate hovers around 6.7%, depending upon what statistics you look at. It could be more. What that means then is for people of color and minorities, that leads to double-digit unemployment in too many American communities. The minimum wage at $7.25, 43.4% of those are inadequately insured with health care. And there are $1.6 trillion, our students are in $1.6 trillion of student loan debt. One of the things that our campaign is deeply concerned about is the racial disparity in funding for public education. We also know that United States infrastructure scored a D+, requiring more than $4 trillion in infrastructure improvements by the year 2025. And right now, US consumer debt has risen to over $14 trillion with a T. So the Our Money campaign is really focused on 3 core areas. Now, I know many of you listening, and every time we do presentations, there are a range of other issues that people that are affecting the communities that we serve, that are affecting the American people. But we have decided to coalesce around 3 core areas. We regard these as sort of central and foundational to the communities and the population that we serve. There's also another aspect of our work that sort of centers around voting rights. I won't talk about that. That centers around protecting our democracy, voting rights, reversing Citizens United. We also are organizing and trying to educate people about ranked choice voting. But the economic policies sort of centers around these three things: a federal job guarantee, Medicare for all, and federal funding of public education, pre-K through college, including for historically Black colleges and universities. Let's first talk about a federal job guarantee. As I mentioned, a federal job guarantee is federally funded and state and locally administered. It is a legal guarantee to a dignified job at a livable wage with benefits for every American that wants one. We are, a job guarantee is something that we're focused on very intently right now. Our advisory council members are all focused on a federal job guarantee, and we're seeking to educate faith leaders, civil rights leaders, and civil rights organizations about the federal job guarantee being the unfinished work of the civil rights movement. The reason a federal job guarantee is so important is that it would end involuntary employment in America. You may wonder, what do you mean by that? What most people don't realize is that right now we leave the issue of employment up to the private sector to manage largely. Right now, the way we do monetary policy, it generally assumes that there will always be between 4 and 8% of the American population that will be unemployed, even in a good economy. Yes, we have dipped below 4%, but what we know is that the economic basis for raising interest rates whenever unemployment gets too low is really unfounded. And so we don't believe that the economy should be balanced on the backs of the unemployed. We believe in aiming towards a full employment economy rather than an economy that seeks maximum unemployment. A federal job guarantee would also improve wages and benefits for those who are already employed. So think about this. The way we try to explain this to people on the street is, let's say, for example, you have a job that pays you $12 an hour, and let's say you believe that you need to make $20 an hour. Well, your employer is not incentivized to pay you $15 or $20 an hour if there's a whole population, 10 to 20 million people who would be glad to take $10 an hour. So what a federal job guarantee does is it provides a floor to wages. It actually raises wages and benefits for everyone by taking out the population of unemployed people from the labor market, making sure they have jobs, dignified jobs, good paying jobs with benefits, childcare, healthcare, et cetera. And so a federal job guarantee would help to improve wages and benefits for those who are already employed. This third goal of a federal job guarantee is one that I'm really excited about, is that a federal job guarantee provides an automatic stabilizer for our economy. Now, right now, many of you know that we are, there's a lot of political debate about the need for more economic stimulus, to provide rescue and relief, right, during these economic times. And while there might be a need for economic stimulus, we believe that we need to move from thinking about stimulus to stabilizers. I sort of talk about this a lot with folks that we train, that we need to move from stimulus to stabilizers. Why should the needs of the American people be held hostage to who is running Congress, to who is the majority leader of the Senate? Why should the ability of people to keep food on the table, a roof over their heads, have health care be held hostage to this, right? And so we believe that there are ways to provide for the American people and to do public spending that are preferable and that are better than the kind of temporary short-term stimulus relief packages that are oftentimes put together. So and there would be no better time for us to have a federal job guarantee than it would have been over the last 12 months. As the private sector strengthens and are able to hire people, then the ability to the need for the federal government to spend money on a job guarantee would decrease. It's an automatic, stabilizer. and it's something that we think is incredibly important. There are two primary areas for creating jobs under a federal job guarantee that we think are really important. The first has to do with investments in infrastructure. The American Society of Civil Engineers is calling for $4.6 trillion of infrastructure improvements in the country by the year of 2025. That's millions of jobs that could be created in water, to improve infrastructure in America. Secondly, by implementing a Green New Deal. Our advisory council member, Pavlina, I believe John just put the title of the book in the chat. Pavlina has just written an incredible book entitled The Case for a Federal Job Guarantee, and talks about the way in which a Green New Deal fits within the goals and ambitions of a federal job guarantee. So the second policy objective that we're pushing for is an MMT-informed approach to Medicare for all. This is important for me to say that we're advocating for and trying to work with advocates around understanding MMT, because even many progressives aren't aware of MMT and don't really understand MMT. But we're focused on an MMT approach to Medicare for all, and we say who want it because we believe that the government should provide single payer, federally funded national health care to every American, free at the point of service, with no networks, no premiums, no deductibles, and no co-pays. And we have decided that, if people, for some reason, we may not know why, elect to want to have their own private insurance, we've decided in the Our Money campaign to temporarily suspend this debate. But since the federal government has the power of the public purse, if it is providing quality, free health care for every American who wants it, this is what we have been pushing for. And we're going to learn later that the federal government has the power of the public purse to fund that. This ends the unnecessary loss of life and bankruptcy due to a lack of health coverage. The third policy area that we're focused on has to do with public education. We know that public education is a critical issue in America. And so right now, public education, as many of you know, is funded largely, about 90%, through state and local taxes. And we're advocating for federal funding of public education, pre-K through college, including the funding of historically Black colleges and universities. We feel that this ends the two-tier system of public education in America, and ends or significantly reduces the disparities in public education in America, wherein it is largely based on state and local property taxes, as I mentioned. The second education policy that we're focused on has to do with the abolition of student loan debt. Abolition of student loan debt. Why should students take out a loan to go to school, to get a job, to spend the next 20 or 30 years paying back that loan? We want to free people from the burden, the shackles of student loan debt. And why shouldn't they? The same money that students are given today as a loan is the same money that was given 25, 30 years ago when I first started college as a grant. When you understand the mechanics of modern money, the same money that we're calling a loan is the same today, is the same money that was called a grant. And so we're calling for the abolition of student loan debt. Okay, so these three areas, federal job guarantee, healthcare, and public education. And again, the federal job guarantee centers around the Green New Deal and infrastructure spending. We believe that these policies need to form the core basis of our economic fight for freedom and justice and equality. Now, in order to fund these policies, we have to be able to answer the fundamental question that we are always asked by politicians and the public, and that's namely, how are we going to pay for it? And this is why I think that modern monetary theory is truly powerful. It is truly transformative. It is the key tool that I believe that we have to advance the fight for social justice and economic justice. And in order to obtain these things, we have to shift our cultural mindset about money and shift our reliance on money created through borrowing and spending, and rely instead on public money rather than bank money. We want to talk about some of that now. Now, the barriers to our progress have to do with the following, because our reliance on the financial sector, I want to suggest, and we believe, causes us to not utilize the power of the public purse through public spending to address our greatest social and economic challenge. Many people don't realize that most of what we think of and use as money or the medium of exchange in our society is not public money, but bank credit money. Most of what we think of and use as money in our societies is bank money at every level. State and local governments, what do they do when they want to build roads, hospitals, schools? They issue bonds, they borrow. Individuals largely rely on credit cards and borrowing, on a mortgage, car notes, education, they take out school loans. Most of what we think of and use as money in our society is credit money. And we work, the public works in large part to pay interest on borrowed money. And we feel that over relying on bank money, on money created as an interest-bearing debt, it leads to economic bondage in our society and is a system that we need to work our way out of. There is a better way. Next slide. Fourth, an economy that relies on bank credit creates economic enslavement. Rather than money being the servant of the people, bank money makes the people the servants of money due to perpetual interest payments. I say oftentimes in our presentations that the average American works 40 to 50 hours a week to pay interest on borrowed money. And this perpetual interest that we're paying on borrowed money unnecessarily enriches the financial sector by siphoning or extracting the wealth of the public into the pockets of the financial sector. This leaves the rest of us to struggle and fight under the weight of economic debts, struggling to survive under the weight of the financial debt from bank loans and mortgages. We go into debt if we get sick, school loans, state and municipal bonds, and the taxes that we have to pay to our state and local governments to pay off interest on borrowed money, and credit card payments. Now, why does this happen? Why is there such an over-reliance on bank money? Well, the reason there's such an over-reliance on bank money is because of the conventional economic model forces us to underutilize the power of the public purse to create public money. The conventional approach to economics and fiscal policy is outdated and is flawed. It assumes that the federal government is limited by revenue when it comes to spending, right? It assumes that the federal government's ability to spend is a lot like a household, right? Your household needs revenue first. Your nonprofit organization needs revenue first in order to spend. Your state or your city needs revenue first in order to spend. So obviously the federal government, so the conventional model assumes, needs revenue first in order to spend. And so because of this, the assumption is that the federal government's purse is limited or constrained by the pool of tax revenue or even borrowing that it is able to engage in order to spend. And so what ends up happening is whenever the public begins to demand funding for big, bold ideas, we get this response from politicians that imply that the federal government is broke. I want to play this clip that really sort of articulates this very same point.
Taking money from our children and borrowing from China. When that note comes due,
to take out a credit card from the Bank of China in the name of our children, driving up our national debt that we are going to have to pay back. That's irresponsible. It's unpatriotic.
We got to deal with this big long-term debt problem, or it will deal with us. It'll gobble up a bigger and bigger percentage of the federal budget.
Join us to stop this fiscal train wreck. Join us to protect our children from an inferior standard of living, from a crushing burden of debt and taxes.
You got a serious deficit crisis, which is where we are right now.
For decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future.
And the deficit thing is real, and the debt thing is real, and we are really in trouble on it at some point.
After we get this done, is there need for comprehensive deficit reduction? The answer is not only yes, but hell yes.
This debt that hangs over our head, a government that spends more money than it takes in. That's not sustainable.
You know, you cannot cut taxes or increase spending unless you can pay for it.
The math of federal spending does not add up.
Bernie says that you have to bring people together, and we have to have Medicare for all. How much is it going to cost? Who's going to pay for it? It will cost more than the entire federal budget we spend now.
No, the math does not add up. In fact, just on 60 Minutes this weekend, he said he wasn't going to rattle through the nickels and the dimes. Well, let me tell you how many nickels and dimes we're talking about. Nearly $60 trillion. Do you know how much that is for all of his programs? That is 3 times the American economy, not the federal government, the entire American economy.
It's impossible to even know how much it's going to cost. And even after raising taxes on everybody making $29,000, there is still a multi-trillion-dollar hole. Matter of fact, if you add up his policies altogether, they come to $50 trillion. He's only explained $25 trillion worth of revenue, which means that the hole in there is bigger than the size of the entire economy of the United States. Where's the other $25 trillion supposed to come from?
The national debt is America's biggest problem.
There's probably not a person listening to me tonight who hasn't heard these very same talking points. Where's the money going to come from? We can't afford Medicare for all. We can't afford a Green New Deal. We can't afford to abolish student loan debt. And when one listens to these politicians at the federal government level, they are oftentimes operating from the assumption that the federal government has the same monetary restrictions as a household, that it needs some revenue first in order to spend. And the assumption is that that revenue comes from borrowing or tax revenue. It then leads to the idea that deficits are inherently bad, and therefore we should never engage in deficit spending unless it's in a crisis, right? It also is based on the misconception that deficit spending inherently leads to hyperinflation. And whenever we do these presentations, you will hear some conventionally minded economist or student point to the economic crises in Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, or Argentina as prime example for how money creation is inherently hyperinflationary. But we believe that these are all misconceptions. And this is why it's critically important that those of us who are committed to progressive issues must understand modern monetary theory. Because what you'll notice from the video that we just saw is that there are politicians on all sides of the political spectrum, conservative, moderate, and liberal, who assume that the federal government needs some source of revenue in order to pay for the things that we need. But this is deeply problematic. MMT is critically important because it helps us to understand several things that we really want to drive home. And you've heard them. If if this is repetitive for you, I apologize, but perhaps there's some new folks joining us tonight. But the federal government does not operate like a household. The federal government does not operate like a household. MNT also helps us to understand that deficit spending is how the federal government puts money into circulation for our benefit. Deficit spending is what we call net public money creation, and inflation, not revenue, is the limit to federal spending. So what I'd like to do is to go through a few of these basic tenets that we want to get out there. So the first is that the federal government does not operate like a household. Now, many of you know, others may not know, that the US government went off the gold standard in 1971. And as such, we went from being a currency user, like a household, to a sovereign currency issuer. And having that sovereignty means that the United States of America can never go broke. The United States of America can never become insolvent unless a political decision to do so is made. That then it opens up enormous potential of the federal government to create money for the things that we need. The ability of the federal government to create money is not limited or constrained by tax revenue. It is not limited or constrained by the gold reserve. And we should not want the federal government's ability to spend to be limited by revenue. That's actually a good thing and not a bad thing. And so while households, businesses, state and local governments need revenue in order to spend, the federal government does not need revenue in order to spend. The federal government can literally create the money to address our greatest social and economic challenges. That's an enormous, an enormous power and observation. And when we talk about spending, we're talking about responsible spending, and I'll talk about a little bit about that later. So what we know from modern monetary theory is that taxes do not fund spending, as we've been told. And I actually think that that's a good thing, because if public needs were held hostage to tax revenue, if we needed the tax money from multi-billionaires in order to have healthcare, in order to have public schools, in order to have infrastructure, we need them to stay billionaires. Just think about that. If we need the revenue of Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and Jeff Bezos in order to have clean water, in order to have decent schools in every community, well, then we need them to stay billionaires. So I don't believe we should hold public needs hostage to whether corporations, whether billionaires, multimillionaires pay taxes. They should pay their taxes, but the federal government does not need tax revenue in order to spend. That's the very important caveat. So you may ask, well, what's the point of taxation for a sovereign government? Taxes give value to the money. If you understand a little bit about money, you know that anyone can create money. Money is merely an IOU or a contract between two people or two entities. So what gives government money its value is, when the government imposes taxes, it then forces people to then go out to earn that particular IOU to produce things for the government. So it adds value to the money. Taxes also helps to manage inflation. It also helps to alter the distribution of wealth in the capitalist economy, and helps to discourage certain bad corporate behavior. So the way that the federal government creates money is when it does the very thing that they tell us not to do, and that's to deficit spend. Now, what is a deficit? A deficit is when you spend more than you bring in revenue. And because conventional economists tend to think about the federal government's budget like a household budget, they want to discourage us from engaging in deficit spending. But in the Our Money campaign, we talk about deficit spending is net public money creations. Governments create and spend money, but they do not tax back 100% of that money. That is why at any given time, a government will be running a deficit. The deficit is merely the difference between all of the cash the government has spent and all of the taxes that it has collected. What I want to do is to try to show you an example to illustrate deficit spending. We try to use this simple example in some of our presentations. So assume that the federal government pays a teacher in this illustration $1,000 for a week's worth of salary, pays her $1,000. And then in this example, assume the federal government taxes back from that teacher 500 of those dollars. Well, on the books of the federal government will have a $500 deficit. That means that it spent $500 more than it received back in taxes. So that's a deficit. But on the teacher's books, she has $500 left over. She has a $500 surplus. And that's a good thing, because with the $500, she can buy gas, she can buy food, she can buy medicine, things of that nature. So the more that the federal government engages in this deficit spending with her and every other person in society, the more the federal government's deficits leads to surpluses in the non-government sector. So that example is intended to show you how the deficit spending is a benefit to society. Now I want to try to show you the balanced budget scenario that conventional mainstream economists say should be the goal of the federal government, to balance the budget. Well, in that scenario, the federal government pays this teacher $1,000. In order for its books to be balanced, it has to tax back $1,000 from that teacher. Now, while the federal government can boast having a balanced budget, and those politicians can go around and boast being fiscally responsible, the problem now is that that teacher has no money left, and yet she has bills, she has obligations, she has food to buy, she needs gas to put in her car, she needs to buy things for her children. And the question becomes, in this balanced budget scenario, what does the teacher or the private citizen do now that they have no money? You got it. They have to borrow. They have to then borrow, take out a credit card. They have to get a loan for a mortgage, loan for a car, loan for school. So this balanced budget scenario is actually benefiting the financial sector. Let me watch my time. Oh my gosh. All right, Virginia, I'm going to wrap it up here. What we see in this slide is that there's an inverse relationship between federal government deficits that you see with the red line and non-government sector surpluses with the green line. Whenever the federal government is in deficit, there's an inverse relationship between surpluses in the private sector. So we should want the federal government to do more deficit spending. And that huge debt number is not a record of the amount of money that the federal government owes. We say this all the time in Our Money campaign, that we need to change the language, the nomenclature that we use about notions like the national debt. Well, it might be better for us to call it the national surplus. And we should want that number to be bigger. You know, they were decrying the debt number when it was 23 billion with a B, and the sky didn't fall. They were saying the same thing 100 years ago. Oh, the debt number is too high. It's not a record of the amount of money that the federal government owes. It's the record of the amount of money that the federal government has put in circulation for public needs and public priorities. And we should want that number to get even larger. So deficit spending does not cost us money. When you hear politicians say, you know, healthcare, Medicare for all will cost us $30 trillion. It will not cost us $30 trillion. I say it creates $30 trillion, right? It creates $30 trillion for doctors and nurses and building hospitals and providing, the jobs that are related to that. So I try not to use the scare tactics that public money costs us. No, it creates money. And that's a good thing as long as it's done in a productive and a constructive way. And so that leads us then to the third principle, that it's inflation and not revenue that's the only limit to federal government spending. Now, we know that so the limit on public money creation is the inflation target. And so inflation occurs when the price of all goods and services rises in an economy, leading to a deflation, leading to the problems that we have. Short of triggering inflation, the federal government can create all the money that we need to address our greatest social and economic challenges. And so what we say is that it's immoral for a government to have no problem creating money when we drop bombs on people of color around the world. If we were to go to war tomorrow, God forbid, no one would decry deficits or the federal debt. They would just create the money for it. So if we can create money to go to war, we should be able to create money to address the war on our healthcare, the war in unemployment, which creates conditions that lead to mass incarceration and crime and violence in too many of our neighborhoods. We should be able to create money to address the war in our environment, to address our greatest existential threat, climate change. We've got to appropriate that same power constructively, responsibly to address these issues as well. And in doing so, there's so many wonderful benefits in society when we appropriate the power of the public purse. When people are not spending all of their money in interest payments or mortgages and car notes and school loans and credit cards, they have more disposable income. They will stimulate the economy. They will spend more. I think the best way to stimulate businesses and small businesses is to strengthen the consumer. And we strengthen the consumer by reducing their debt obligations. Our state and local governments will be less strained if we harness and appropriate the power of the public purse for infrastructure, roads, bridges, employment, job creation, public education, so many incredible benefits. And as a result, we can do that without relying on local and state taxes as a result. Next slide, Tamika. Oh yes, so what about hyperinflation? So hyperinflation is often thrown out as the inherent consequence of public money creation. The conventional assumption is that creating more money inherently is hyperinflationary. But we believe that this is not the case. The often quoted examples of Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and Argentina, and assuming that it is necessarily the result of more money creation that caused the inflation there is historically problematic. There are other conditions that resulted in the hyperinflation in those countries and their economic collapse. And it's mainly the result of the fact that those countries lack monetary sovereignty. When your money is not denominated in your own unit of measure, then it's going to lead to these kinds of conditions. So all of the scare tactics that are often thrown out there, I want to encourage advocates to not be afraid of these scare tactics that are oftentimes used to frighten us about advocating for more public money for public priorities. So where do we go from here? We have got to organize. One of the things that Our Money campaign is about to start doing is organizing by congressional districts. Because citizens in communities have got to begin to organize by congressional districts. And this is what we're doing right now. We have developed our public policy agenda. It's on our website. The Our Money campaign's website is ourmoneyus.org. You can go to our website. Our public policy agenda is entitled the Repair and Restore Agenda. We're going to be organizing people by their congressional districts so that we can then go to our elected officials and say, hey, there's 1,000 people in this district, 2,000 people, 3,000 people, 10,000 people in this district who want a federal job guarantee, Medicare for all, federal funding of public education, pre-K through college. This has really been important to me because I have found as an African-American faith leader, civil rights voice, that one of the things that we have failed to do is to attach our vote to a particular vision for America that is linked to a specific public policy agenda. So we elect people for office, but we have no policy agenda to hold them accountable. And we're beginning to define that agenda to be centered around a federal job guarantee, Medicare for all, and federal funding of public education, pre-K through college. All right, I have gone over my time. Virginia, I want to turn the call back over to you and John, and to see if there are any questions for me.
Well, thank you so much. And of course, there are questions.